A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii turned into a nightmare that would echo across the world. Without warning, the Japanese Imperial Navy launched a devastating surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, battleships burned, planes exploded on the runways, and over 2,000 American servicemen were dead. The attack was more than a military strike. It was a psychological shockwave. America, long distant from the ravages of war in Europe and Asia, was suddenly thrust into global conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would later call it a date which will live in infamy. And indeed it did. In the days that followed, the mood across the United States was one of disbelief, anger, and uncertainty. The mighty American fleet, believed to be untouchable, had been crippled. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across the Pacific, capturing Guam, Wake Island, and sweeping into the Philippines. Allied defenses crumbled before Japan's momentum. For the first time in generations, Americans feared the war might reach their own shores. On the West Coast, blackout drills became routine. Civilians built bomb shelters. Newspapers printed maps showing the terrifying reach of Japanese bombers. And in Washington, military leaders faced a grim question. How could they strike back? President Roosevelt knew that America needed not just a military plan, but a symbol, something to restore hope and prove that Japan was not invincible. The country needed to show that the United States would not remain on the defensive. Amid this atmosphere of despair, a bold idea began to form within the corridors of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The concept was simple in words but audacious in execution. Launch an air raid against the Japanese homeland, directly over Tokyo itself. No one had ever attempted such a mission. Japan's cities were thousands of miles from any American base, and the Pacific Ocean offered no place for bombers to land or refuel. Yet one man believed it could be done. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a pioneering aviator, scientist, and test pilot. Doolittle had a reputation for turning the impossible into reality. He understood that a strike against Tokyo, even a small one, could transform American morale overnight. Plans were drawn in secret. The idea: modify medium-range B-25 Mitchell bombers so they could take off from an aircraft carrier, something never done before. The crews would bomb military and industrial targets in Japan, then fly on to friendly territory in China. It was a one-way mission, and every man involved knew the risks. As the plan took shape, secrecy was absolute. Only a handful of senior officers were aware of the details. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet was chosen as the launch platform. In early April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers were hoisted onto its deck, their wings barely fitting within the narrow space. Sailors on board were told only that they were on a special mission. While preparations continued, Japan celebrated its triumph. Tokyo propaganda broadcasts claimed that the decadent Americans had neither the courage nor the capability to strike back. The Japanese public was assured that the emperor's homeland was untouchable, shielded by distance and divine protection. But beneath that confidence, cracks were beginning to form. Japanese intelligence officers knew that the United States had enormous industrial capacity. If America's factories and spirit were fully mobilized, the balance of power could shift rapidly. And in Washington, Roosevelt's advisors warned him that morale was collapsing, that Americans needed proof their enemy could be hurt. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Doolittle's men trained in secret at Eglin Field, Florida. They practiced short takeoffs, simulating the limited runway of an aircraft carrier. They studied maps of Japan, learned survival techniques for potential capture, and wrote letters home they might never deliver. Each man understood the odds were slim. None expected to return. By mid-April, the plan was ready. 16 bombers, 80 men, 1 carrier, and a mission that could change the course of the war. The operation was codenamed simply the Doolittle Raid. As the Hornet sailed westward through the Pacific, the atmosphere on board was tense but determined. The crew knew they were heading toward danger, but few realized just how close to Japan they would get. Admiral William Halsey's task force accompanied them, cutting through rough seas and unpredictable weather. The mission was designed for precision. Launch the bombers about 400 miles from Japan, strike key industrial targets, then continue on to Chinese airfields. It was daring, almost reckless, but in those dark months after Pearl Harbor, America had nothing to lose. Back home, families listened to nightly radio broadcasts filled with grim war news, the fall of Singapore, the siege of the Philippines, the capture of Allied troops. Yet somewhere, deep within the chaos, a quiet hope began to grow. Rumors spread that something big was coming, that the United States was preparing its first strike against Japan. For Roosevelt and his generals, the Doolittle Raid was never meant to deal heavy damage. Its purpose was symbolic, to remind both America and Japan that this war was far from over, and that the American people were only beginning to fight. In the darkness following Pearl Harbor, this single act of defiance would ignite a spark, one that would soon blaze into a global counteroffensive. The sleeping giant, as the Japanese had called the United States, was awakening. And once awake, it would never rest again. April 18, 1942. The Pacific Ocean was restless beneath a gray sky. Waves crashed against the decks of the USS Hornet, carrying 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers toward destiny. Each aircraft bore the markings of the United States Army Air Forces, but none had ever attempted what these men were about to do: launch from an aircraft carrier into enemy skies. At dawn, the task force was still hundreds of miles from Japan when a Japanese patrol vessel was spotted on the horizon. It was the Nido Maru, one of the many sentinels guarding Japan's eastern approaches. The crew of the Hornet knew they had been seen. To prevent discovery, the U.S. destroyer Nashville opened fire, sinking the vessel, but not before it had radioed a warning to Tokyo. The element of surprise was slipping away. Faced with the risk of Japanese retaliation, Mission Commander Jimmy Doolittle made a decision that could mean life or death. Launch the raid immediately, even though they were still more than 650 miles from Japan, far beyond the planned distance. It meant that the bombers would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching the safety of Chinese airfields. But Doolittle didn't hesitate. The order was given: launch all aircraft. One by one, the bombers rolled forward on the short, pitching deck. The sea spray hit their windshields as engines roared and propellers spun. Sailors lined the deck, saluting each crew as they took off. Doolittle's own aircraft was first to go. The takeoff was risky. Barely 500 feet of runway on a heaving ship, but his plane lifted just above the waves and climbed into the mist. Cheers erupted from the deck below. 16 planes followed, each carrying 4 bombs, incendiary and high explosive, destined for Japan's industrial and military centers. The targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. The men flew low over the Pacific, hugging the waves to avoid detection by Japanese radar. For 6 long hours they crossed open ocean, cold and silent, knowing that one mechanical failure could doom them to the sea. As the coast of Japan appeared through the clouds, hearts pounded. For many of the young airmen, this was their first time seeing the enemy homeland. They had been told that the Japanese people worshipped their emperor as divine, that Tokyo was untouchable. But now the untouchable was about to burn. At 12:15 p.m., Doolittle's plane approached Tokyo. The crew could see factories, oil tanks, and rail yards below. Anti-aircraft guns began to fire, black puffs of smoke erupting in the sky. Doolittle released his bombs over a military-industrial district. Moments later, explosions rippled across the city. Flames rose, and columns of smoke twisted into the afternoon sky. Throughout central Japan, alarms wailed as sirens warned civilians to take cover. But the Japanese air defense system was unprepared. No one expected enemy bombers to come from the sea. Some citizens thought it was a training exercise. Confusion spread as more explosions rocked Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Each American crew carried out its mission swiftly. They didn't linger. Their goal wasn't to destroy the Japanese war machine. It was to strike at its heart. Factories producing aircraft parts and military equipment were damaged. An oil storage facility burned fiercely for hours. Though the physical destruction was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. As the last bombs fell, the crews turned west toward China. But the long journey home had only just begun. The extra distance caused by the early launch meant fuel levels were dangerously low. A few planes diverted toward the Soviet Union, but most continued toward Chinese territory controlled by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, allies of the United States. Darkness fell. Rain and strong winds battered the bombers. Navigating by dead reckoning, the pilots searched for any sign of land. Some crews ditched their planes along the coast. Others bailed out into the night sky. Doolittle himself jumped from his aircraft near Chuzhou, China, rolling across the ground upon landing. When he realized his entire crew had survived, he wept with relief. Not all were so fortunate. Several airmen were captured by Japanese patrols in occupied China. 8 were taken prisoner. 3 would be executed, and 1 died in captivity. Yet even as these tragedies unfolded, word of the raid spread rapidly through Asia. In Tokyo, the government first denied that any American bombers had reached Japan. But as witnesses described the explosions and burning factories, the truth could no longer be hidden. Emperor Hirohito was reportedly shocked. The attack shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had surrounded Japan since the war began. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, then nowhere was safe. In the United States, news of the raid broke days later. Details were scarce. No one knew the fate of the crews, but the headlines electrified the nation. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans celebrated. The sleeping giant had struck back. The raid's success boosted morale, sending a clear message. The United States was not defeated, and it would carry the fight across oceans if necessary. But in Japan, the emotional reaction was the opposite. The military was humiliated. The high command demanded answers. How could such an attack occur under their watch? The Japanese Navy resolved to expand its defensive perimeter, leading directly to a new operation aimed at destroying America's carrier force once and for all. That decision would set the stage for the Battle of Midway, a confrontation that would change the course of the Pacific War. The Doolittle raid had achieved what no one thought possible. Though the bomb damage was small, its symbolic power was immense. For Japan, it was a warning that the war would reach their own doorstep. For America, it was proof that even in its darkest days, courage and ingenuity could turn despair into defiance. As the fires over Tokyo faded into the night, one truth became undeniable. The war in the Pacific had entered a new phase. The world's mightiest empire had been touched by the hands of men who refused to surrender. And the echo of their engines carried a message across the Pacific. The Americans were only beginning to fight. The morning after the Doolittle raid, the Japanese Empire was in shock. The unthinkable had happened. American bombs had fallen on Tokyo, the heart of the imperial nation. Smoke still lingered above the city, and civilians whispered in disbelief. For the first time in the war, the Japanese people realized that their homeland was not invincible. The military government, built on the myth of absolute security, had been exposed. Emperor Hirohito was informed of the attack with careful restraint. The Army and Navy ministers assured him that the damage was minor. A few fires, some destroyed factories, several dozen casualties. But the psychological impact ran much deeper. Japan's leaders had promised the emperor that no foreign aircraft could ever reach the home islands. Now that promise had been broken. The military high command convened in emergency sessions. Anger and humiliation filled the room. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, sat in silence as his subordinates debated how such an event could have occurred. He knew the truth. The Americans had launched bombers from an aircraft carrier, a tactic so daring and unpredictable that it defied conventional thinking. Yamamoto understood that this was not merely a raid, it was a message. The United States, though wounded, was far from defeated. Its industrial power, its manpower, and its spirit were awakening. He warned that unless Japan dealt a decisive blow soon, the tide of war would turn against them. In Tokyo, propaganda tried to downplay the event. Newspapers were censored. The public was told that a few enemy planes had slipped through but caused only minor damage. Yet rumors spread quickly. Civilians could see the burned neighborhoods, the bomb craters, and the wreckage. Fear began to creep into daily life. The illusion of Japan's invulnerability was gone. Behind closed doors, Yamamoto pushed for a new operation, one that would destroy the American aircraft carriers before they could strike again. His target, a small, strategically vital atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. By luring the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap near Midway, he hoped to annihilate them and force Washington to negotiate peace on Japan's terms. It was a bold plan, but also a fatal overreach. As Japan prepared for its next move, the United States celebrated the Doolittle raiders as heroes. When news of their survival reached Washington, President Roosevelt praised them as the men who struck the first blow. The American public, still mourning the loss of Pearl Harbor, found renewed hope. War bond sales surged. Young men lined up to enlist. The sleeping giant, as Yamamoto had once called America, was now fully awake. Across the Pacific, Japan's retaliation was swift and brutal, but misdirected. Believing that the Doolittle planes had refueled in Chinese territory, Japanese forces launched a horrific campaign across eastern China to punish those who had helped the Americans. Entire villages were burned. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in what became known as the Zhujiangjiangxi campaign. It was one of the darkest reprisals of the war, and it only deepened Chinese resistance. Meanwhile, American cryptanalysts, the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor, had begun intercepting and deciphering Japanese naval communications. By late May 1942, they discovered Yamamoto's plan to strike at Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, prepared a countertrap. For the first time since the war began, the Americans would not be reacting, they would be waiting. In early June, the Battle of Midway began. For Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sailed confidently into the fight, unaware that American forces already knew their positions. On June 4th, waves of U.S. Navy dive bombers descended from the clouds and turned the sea into a graveyard. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were engulfed in flames. The 4th followed hours later. It was one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Japan had lost its best pilots, its most experienced crews, and the very heart of its carrier fleet. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted forever. The victory at Midway was the direct consequence of the Doolittle raid. The shock of that small attack had forced Japan into a reckless operation, driven by pride and fear. And in doing so, it set the stage for its own undoing. In America, Doolittle returned home to a hero's welcome. He expected to be court-martialed. After all, every one of his planes had been lost. But instead, President Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor. When asked how he felt about the mission, Doolittle replied simply, "We proved that the Japanese homeland was not beyond reach." For the Japanese Empire, the Doolittle raid was a warning ignored. It awakened the realization that this war would not be quick or easy, and that the Americans would stop at nothing to win. For the United States, it was a spark that ignited the full fury of its industrial and military power. By late 1942, American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, and ships at a pace the world had never seen. Every bomb dropped over Tokyo had been answered 100-fold by the roar of new engines rolling off assembly lines. The Pacific was no longer Japan's domain. It was becoming America's battleground. As months turned into years, the lessons of the Doolittle raid endured. A handful of men in 16 planes had changed the course of history. They had transformed defeat into determination, fear into resolve. The fires that burned over Tokyo had illuminated a simple truth: that courage, when fueled by purpose, could awaken a nation. The Japanese Empire had been stirred from its dream of dominance. The Americans, awakened by loss and bound by unity, were marching toward victory. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the skies over Tokyo, and now to the turning point at Midway, the Pacific War had entered its most decisive chapter. And as the sun set over the vast ocean that had once divided them, both nations understood. The age of empires was ending, and the world would never be the same again.